We're off again, this time to Thailand, Cambodia and Vietnam to see some of the wonderful sights and sounds of those beautiful countries and to explore some of the more regrettable things too. Bangkok is a beautiful city, both by night and by day, with its huge skyscrapers, very busy. And it didn't take us very long to unpack. Breakfast this morning was at the Rembrandt Hotel, which is pretty much in the centre of Bangkok, and then we all caught the coach which was to take us to the Burma Railway Museum. As we crossed through the busy city streets, Ek described to us the best eating places as we drove through the Chinese sector.
Road, that is the biggest street food of Thailand. That is also the best street food of Thailand. The food is clean enough for you because mostly is the foreigner or the tourist for this one. Not only the Chinese, Thai food, fruit, snack, Thai dishes also are selling on that street.
And then to Kanchanaburi and the Death Railway Museum. It was founded by a chap called Rod Beatty and opened as late as 2003, which surprised me because I thought that there would have been a building to commemorate the plight of the workforce and the awful war crimes that were committed during its construction much earlier. This museum was an eye-opener for many of us, a sobering reminder of the horrors that took place on what is now generally referred to as the Death Railway. And the whole point of this exhibition is to present the story of the Thailand to Burma Railway, which was built by prisoners of war taken by the Imperial Japanese Army. The pictures are harrowing and are evidence of the horrendous cruelty suffered by prisoners of the Japanese. Their captors cared nothing for them, and the objective was to build a railway to transport Japanese troops, no matter what the cost to human life. Living conditions were degrading in the extreme, and were certainly in breach of the Geneva Convention. For me, it seemed that each one of these spikes represented the death of an individual, and my word, there are thousands of them. Over 100,000 perished in all. And yet, in spite of the vile backdrop of their situation, the men strove to maintain their dignity, doing their best to keep clean, shave each morning, and combing their hair. There's a poignancy about these cabinets containing the prisoners' toiletries and their personal possessions. The museum shows film of survivors who describe how they suffered under the Japanese, many engaged in felling trees and clearing jungle in preparation for laying the track. Thousands of acres were cleared in all. Those who laboured on the railway were from many nations, mainly Asian, and all have stories to tell. The trees they felled were used for making sleepers into which these hundreds of thousands of spikes were driven into along the 258-mile length of the railway. The torment did of course come to an end when the Japanese surrendered. The museum shows a great respect for those who died in the railway's construction, and some of the graves are still there. There is a scale model of the railway and its bridges in one of the galleries. Opposite the museum is the Chung Hai War Cemetery, in which victims of the railway are buried, including British POWs. Once we had toured the museum and had a snack break, we joined the train at Nam Tok station. We didn't have long to wait on the platform, and that gave us the chance to look at some of the trains in the sidings. The weather was very hot, some 38 degrees, and we were glad of our water bottles. Once the train had arrived, we were all shown to the allocated seats that had been reserved for us by Newmarket. The carriages were a bit basic, with the air conditioning supplied by an overhead fan. It made little difference. Nevertheless, it was quite comfortable, and we passed through busy stations, upon which we couldn't help noticing how many Europeans were on the platforms. But many have migrated here to the warmer climate of Asia, and thousands of Britons are moving to Thailand to live, mainly pensioners.
We're now on the Burma Railway to the bridge over the River Kwai.
And there's the country's flag again. The design symbolises the colours of liberty used by allies Britain, France and the United States. Red is the colour of blood shed by Thai people for their country's freedom. White represents the purity of Buddhism, and blue is for royalty that guides the nation. Before long, we were speeding into rural Thailand through the paddy fields and farms which provide Thailand with much of its rice and other vegetables. Train travel is one of the best ways of seeing a country, and of course there is a vast contrast between city life and the countryside. Thailand is lush and full of vegetation, and it's legal to grow cannabis here. One of the first things we noticed in Bangkok was how many cannabis stores there are. It's a major crop, and of course, because it is legal to use, there is no criminal activity involved in the sale of consumption of marijuana. Here we get a glimpse of the River Kwai. Another reason for travelling by train is meeting new and interesting people, and we had quite a long conversation with this chap, whose name we never learned, but he had studied in the UK, I think, as an engineer. You wouldn't think that a place so associated with death here on the Death Railway would attract so much commercial activity, but it does, and the vendors plague you as soon as you arrive. Kate is about to walk over the famous bridge on the River Kwai, over which the Japanese sent locomotives such as this. We're smiling as our photo is taken at the centre of the bridge, but we are well aware of the pain and misery that went into building it. After a tour of Bangkok, we were taken by coach to the floating market, which was a chance to join a 6-seater boat and tour the riverside shops and stores. The weather was hot and a little humid, but the breeze from the river made it much more comfortable. It's quite an effort getting into these small boats, but once settled inside, the engine fires up and we're on our way. So this is the floating market, hour and a half from Bangkok, and all the markets are at the side of the river. There are several floating markets in Bangkok, but we're on the Mekong River, and this one is known as the Damnoen Saduak. There is a speed limit of 20 kilometers per hour along most parts of the river, but it's not universally adhered to, and even our boat's pilot decided to rev up. We raced along for a few minutes, and it seems that everyone's in a hurry, and then we slowed down to a more stately pace to view the very many shops and riverside businesses and restaurants. There's the Thai flag, and look at these lovely lush palms. Some of these dwellings are older than they look. Some date from the 17th century, and there's quite a large floating population. And of course, a temple is never far away. There are specially constructed walkways for the residents and tradespeople to walk along, and it has a well-organised infrastructure for those who live and work on the river. Now, as you can see, the water hyacinth is everywhere on the river. We saw a lot of this in India, but it's an unwelcome import into Asia from South America, and it has no predators, so it's starting to infest the waterways. So far there's no useful application for it in Thailand, but for the time being. It's New Year, and as on land, the decorations celebrating it are everywhere. Our journey touring the floating market came to an end, and here's my Katie making her way to the gift and souvenir shops. Obviously this is a major source of income, and the tourist season was just beginning. You can shop until you drop, or watch the boats go past. You can buy anything from tourist tat to fresh fruit. Katie cannot resist a bangle or a necklace when she sees one. Having a cup of green tea this time, green tea in the floating market. It's about an hour and a half from Bangkok. We've just been on the river, and it's time for tea and a coffee.
Very sweet. Very sweet too.
Here's a little pussycat, and I always try to get a cat into my films if I can. Plenty of fish for this one, I should think. And so there's a little way to drive to the Yok Yor Riverside restaurant in central Bangkok, and our guide Ek runs through the day's itinerary.
This means the river of the king. Today we serve you with the buffet lunch. Buffet lunch that you can take anything you like. And tables. For all of the drinks, please pay by your own of the drink, except tea and coffee are included, and the rest please pay by your own.
The selection of Thai food was tremendous, as it was everywhere we ventured. Plenty of everything, and oh, look, it's the Lone Ranger.
Right now we are in the area of the temple complex in this corner. We are here. That is the building number 8. It's right here. This is building number 8. This is the entrance, the entry to the royal temple. Now we are here, and the way to visit the palace, just only one way visit.
Next stop, the Great Royal Temple. It's vast, and to be honest, you really need an entire day to appreciate all the fine ancient buildings. Most are built from marble. Some of these stone figures reminded me of the terracotta army warriors who we saw on our visit to China some years ago. Some of their expressions are similar. I wonder if by any chance they are related. The complex architecture was astounding, as were the beautiful murals we saw. It was a very hot day, and we kept having to remind ourselves that this was January, and there are large numbers of tourists, no doubt escaping the cold of their own countries. Some of the structures are covered in gold leaf. All are impressive and demonstrate the religious faith of those who built them. I did wonder what goes on in these vast edifices.
We're at the Wat Pho Temple in Bangkok. But we got here on a tuk-tuk, which saved us a 10 minutes walk in this blistering heat.
The Wat Pho Temple is also known as the Temple of the Reclining Buddha. gold leaf covers the image in its entirety, and the soles are inlaid with mother of pearl, which are divided into 108 arranged panels showing symbols such as flowers, dancers, elephants and tigers. Each side of the Buddha there are bronze bowls into which worshippers drop coins, and this is believed to bring good luck and long life. There was a tremendous aroma of incense sticks and scented candles inside the temple. Some wonderful buildings here. And who's banging that gong? Oh, it's Katie. Put that gong back a back, Katie. And what does this say in Taiwanese? It translates as Happy New Year 2024. Today we're paying a visit to the Cambodia Peace Gallery in Batam Bang. It's a place for reflection on Cambodia's journey from war to peace and reconciliation. I remember being at this demonstration in London against the war in the 1970s. We were told by our guide that it was a time of ghastly atrocities committed during the time when the Khmer Rouge controlled the country, and the various maps help explain the extent of the conflict. He gave us a background to the war and how to follow the events in the galleries.
We're in the Cambodian Peace Museum, which is very interesting.
The gallery opened in 2018 and focuses on how Cambodians worked together to end the war following the invasion by Vietnam. Cambodia was once called Kampuchea and its people Khmers. Thousands of victims of the war were imprisoned in camps throughout the former Cambodia, all shown on this map. Basically, it was the poor who were punished as the country was isolated. It led to chaos and destruction on a huge scale, as well as the murder of peasants and intellectuals, all graphically illustrated. As always, civilians suffer more than anyone else during war, and especially children who are caught up in it. We saw the uniforms of both sides and all the awful hardware of war, including these mines, which are still causing injuries today. Princess Diana, when she was alive, campaigned to ban them, but with little success. But peace did come, and this has been a success story for the United Nations. The Cambodian military was transformed into a unifying force to demine the country. The country was to be rehabilitated and rebuilt, especially schools and roads and hospitals. And most of all, it was to become a democracy. And so began Cambodia's journey from war towards peace and a positive future. It didn't happen overnight. There were peace conferences in Paris, Tokyo and Pattaya throughout 1990 and 1991. My conclusion was that it's the men in suits who start wars and other men in suits who end them. The United Nations has played a very important role in making Cambodia a safe and peaceful country again, and the gallery recognises as much. This is the table at which officials sat down and signed a peace accord. Inside and outside the building, the symbolism is everywhere in artwork and photographs. One thing the Peace Gallery wants to emphasise is the role of women peacekeepers belonging to the UN forces and the newly formed Cambodian forces. Women can be examples to all, reflecting what men can do, women can do just as well, which we guys have to accept. In the picture gallery is an illustration of a gun with a knot in the barrel, as well as children destroying one, the point being that the pencil is mightier than the gun. On a flag depicting Angkor Wat, peace is celebrated, and the Cambodian nation is recognised now by every peace-loving country in the world. It's a great little museum, and here Katie signs the gallery's visitors book. Here at Phnom Penh, we're visiting the Chua Sieng Museum, once a school and still surrounded by barbed wire. It tells the story of how Cambodian people suffered under the evil Pol Pot and his democratic republic, which, like all democratic republics, was anything but. Former classrooms and play areas became interrogation and torture rooms. Inmates were treated brutally, particularly intellectuals. Urban professionals were sent out to the countryside to work in fields. This chilling notice gives helpful advice to those imprisoned within, and the ever-present threat of execution. Just charming, weren't they, the Khmer Rouge? Yet one of our guides was a former Khmer Rouge member, and anxious to explain that he was brainwashed into serving the mad dictator who wanted to return the country to year zero. He related all the dreadful things that happened in these rooms all those years ago. Outside the building is a huge photograph of some of the victims, none of whom are alive today. Every victim was photographed. Look at the terror on the faces of those who came to this building. I wondered how many were ill-treated, but it must have run into thousands. They were tortured and starved, and yet those who carried out the torture usually ended up tortured themselves. The conditions of forced labour under Pol Pot were dreadful. Outside this former hellhole is a memorial to remember the crimes of the regime. The bad guys were rounded up and put on trial, but of course they knew nothing. There are thousands of survivors, many mentally damaged, and to earn a living, some have written harrowing accounts of their experiences, and they sell their signed books to visitors and tourists. The museum is a centre to study white genocide, and the abuse of human rights still occurs. We're on a trip out into rural Cambodia among the cattle and cows, all of which are very important to the agricultural economy, as are these ducks and chickens. They're very cute, but they're all for consumption. Whether we are in Kumartin, Cumbria, Oakhampton or Cambodia, we always seem to end up at a blacksmith's. It's a very noisy operation, and the heat was quite intense from the coke-fired furnace. He keeps his coke outside, out here in the yard. When we came across him, he was making a farm implement out of recycled steel. Not much health and safety in this place, but he knows what he's doing. Just opposite, by the river, a house is being built from bamboo. And in the afternoon, we are welcomed to the temple, where it's time for a quick blessing. It was quite an elaborate ceremony, with lots of arm waving and chanting, and we were all given a piece of red string to tie round our wrist. I still had mine on a month later.
This is an aerial view of the city of Battambang. It's a very attractive city with bustling streets and a busy market, and I always love a good market. The bigger and busier the better, and it's fun searching for bargains. On sale were fruit and vegetables, household goods, cosmetics, toiletries, the usual fast food, and a huge jewellery store full of rings and bracelets. I prefer to look at the clothing, but nothing really suited me on that day.
We've arrived at the Watek Nom Pagoda, which is situated around 8 kilometres north of Batam Bang. Here's a statue of the Buddha. Besides the Buddhist temple, which is impressive in terms of the architecture and the very intricate carving and elaborate stonework and soaring columns, there are various shrines and statues. Some of these buildings were being constructed whilst we in Britain were living in fairly basic communities. You can go inside these buildings, but they do appreciate your taking off your shoes, which is why I always carry a shoe horn everywhere I go. You can never fail to be impressed by the sheer scale of these temples, and of course they took years to build. We're at the ruined temple at Batam Bang. A lot of this has been looted and destroyed.
It's about 1,000 years old.
But it's about 1,000 or so years old, and it's very impressive in its scale. You can climb all over it, but we would prefer not to today because it's quite a dangerous place to climb around. Among these largely ruined buildings is the giant statue of Buddha, which is pretty much intact. But everywhere else is littered with stone from the disintegrated structures. You have to watch where you walk. There are wooden steps that you can climb upon. Imagine what this looked like in its prime. You can see all this decorative work all the way down here. We spent about half an hour or so looking around the remains of this glorious set of buildings. This was once an entrance or exit to one of the temple buildings. You can see where the windows once were, and this infrastructure here all tumbled down. Even the coving you can see, the original coving which was on the ceilings, but all that's vanished. And there's a very old tree here, probably hundreds of years old, still surviving. The day was a very hot one, especially for January, and rather warmer than it would have been at home. It's lovely to explore these relics that date back so far in history, but it wasn't long before I caught the aroma of some food being cooked on the roadside, and there it was, frying fish, sizzling away. They serve it to you inside a bamboo leaf. It's absolutely delicious, the street food. It's some kind of fish. I don't know what kind of fish it is. Nevertheless, it's spicy and it's charred, and it tastes beautiful. I think hairy bikers would enjoy this. And here's one now. An hour or so later, our bus arrives in Kampong Kliang, the community village not far from Siem Reap, which is situated beside a lake, which we'll be taking a boat upon, but thankfully not this one, I might add. Now this community is a floating village in that the houses occupied by the villagers are mainly on stilts to prevent them from being flooded. The chief commodity of this village is fish, and here it all is, being dried in the baking sun before it all goes off to market. It's all laid out on these wooden trestle tables, and they are made locally too. You can't get much fresher than this. Everywhere you look there are fish, fish, fish. Oddly, there was no smell of fish. In our hometown of Ilfracombe, this lot would have been gobbled up by seagulls within minutes. Somebody in our group did make the point that they weren't attracting any kind of pest.
Surprised there aren't more flies around.
The natives were friendly to us, but they endure the prying eyes of tourists every day. They were very engaging, but as I looked at the fish, it did occur to me how unsettling it would feel if someone stood outside my home and pulled out a camera in order to film all my activities. But it wasn't all about fish. The fruit and vegetables on this stall were for local consumption. The kids love the tourists, and it's a chance to make a few reels. That's the Cambodian currency. After we had had a good look around the village and got a flavour of all the life in a Cambodian rural community, we boarded our coach and drove along the central road. There are various small industries, mainly surrounding agriculture and timber. Clothing is also made here in small workshops and either exported or sold locally. These villages are quite self-sufficient.
Village's local market, you can see seller is smiling.
Everywhere you go in Southeast Asia, you see people working and making a living. If you don't work, you starve. There are no benefits. Everyone has to find a market for their labour, whichever skill they may have. There's no room for layabouts. And so we approached the lake where we board the boats at the Tonle Sap Lake. There's a Buddha statue towering above the waterside, watching over his devotees.
On the boat going round the lake, like the floating villages.
A speeding boat passes our lazy cruise. The people operating the boats depend entirely on tourism, which makes us feel less guilty about the carbon footprint we are leaving after flying here and flying home. I loved this journey on the lake. The floating communities are either side and are home to thousands of Cambodians. It's a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. It's not quite right to describe these scenes as picturesque poverty. It is hard to make a living in these parts, but nevertheless their industry is completely sustainable, and people will always want fish and the other products which are manufactured alongside the lake. And there is the Chong Prole Primary School. After an hour or so on our guided tour of the lake, we return to Kampong Kliang. Tomorrow it's a trip to Angkor Wat. This is the immigration office between Thailand and Cambodia. Today there is a possibility of a visit to Angkor Wat, which is the highlight of many of our fellow tourists' agenda during our visit to Cambodia. Angkor Wat is a Hindu temple built nearly 1,000 years ago. It covers about 162 hectares within the ancient Khmer capital city of Angkor. It's surrounded by a huge moat, and it's the largest religious building in the world. And of course, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Lots of beautiful gardens and lawns surround the temple, which contains many iconic figures and carvings. Everywhere you go, there is something amazing to see. And it's a good place to get married. Just entering the second temple in this Angkor Wat complex. A huge number of steps, stairs, wooden stairs between the buildings, and I'm about to climb another few. I'm afraid that the heat and humidity has seriously affected the film quality, so my apologies for that. It's flipping huge, this place. You have to keep sitting down, having a drink of water, and the temperature must be about 36 degrees, and that's in January. There's lots of piles of rubble, but everyone who comes here is blown away by the sheer scale of it. Over 2.5 million people come to see it every year. It's dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. It has suffered a lot of damage in its time during wars and conflicts, but Angkor Wat Temple eventually became a Buddhist site. You can climb stairs, and they are very steep stairs, to the top of one of the towers. Not much in the way of health and safety at this site, but a lot of these tourists are in their 70s and 80s, and it's a very hot day. After the climb, Katie is looking down at one of the courtyards.
It's a special view here over the whole site, and there's an air balloon just as a bonus.
The whole area is protected from developments, of course. Now here she is, no spring chicken, tackling even more steps before venturing inside and taking a look at some of the ancient figures that occupy the temple. These two are Buddhists, of course, and that's a donation box if anyone would like to make one. On one of the bridges across the moat there are some more figures, all hand carved and looking very tranquil, I think, as they guard the temple. So here we all are. We've been taken to the Ta Prohm Temple, usually referred to as the Tomb Raider Temple or the Angelina Jolie Temple, due to its depiction in the film Lara Croft, Tomb Raider. Like all our guides, Nak had a tremendous knowledge of all the places we visited. He has to repeat his narration again and again, and here he is describing the general area. These structures have stood for centuries and nature has ravaged them, but the religious artifacts are being preserved for future generations. Music is provided, of course, but it's a bit repetitive and not very melodic. But nevertheless, it's all played on traditional instruments. I wonder, who is this, bunging in a few coins? You can see why this place made an ideal film location. But one of the strangest features is the number of trees which have taken root in the buildings. These roots are very long and cling to the stone before reaching into the earth. It's difficult to see how they survive, given the amount of water they need. Much of this temple was hidden from human eyes for a very long time, and this is living proof that when humanity abandons an area, nature will take over. Katie loved walking around this place, but you really do have to watch where you're going. But we had to leave Cambodia, and here we are at the border with Vietnam. It's quite picturesque, actually, with nice gardens, but a dreadful loo. Katie walks down to the boat, which will take us along the Mekong River to Can Tho. Can Tho is a beautiful seaside resort, quite upmarket, and it's just the place to stay for the communist leaders who believe that everyone should have the same facilities as long as they themselves don't have to mix with the workers.
This is the Victoria Can Tho Resort Hotel. Very posh, very nice.
Yes, it was very nice. And one thing I remember is the vast aquarium in the reception hall. Lots of tropical fish in there. We're in this very small resort town of Can Tho in Vietnam. And that's where the hotel Katie was just telling you about is situated. So it's a rather hot, humid night, January, and over the road there are all the cafes and bars. There are plenty of them. Later on we're going to have a meal in the hotel, a buffet apparently. Yes, the food is always very good in Newmarket appointed hotels. It was a very good menu as always. And here Outside the hotel, along the street a bit, there were local youth dancing to Western music and wearing Western clothes. What does that tell you in Vietnam? In the Victoria Hotel's beautiful garden, we had our alfresco dinner listening to some traditional Vietnamese music. Today we are at the Cu Chi Tunnel Museum, which was once a jungle fighting area. Our guide, whose name is Hai, showed us maps and explained very clearly how and where the communists and Americans fought across Vietnam. There are still a lot of tanks and armoured vehicles lying around. The Americans were constantly bombing with explosives, but to disrupt guerrilla warfare, they dropped Agent Orange to defoliate the jungle and expose the fighters. It didn't work, but it had a terrible effect on the civilian population. And this is one of the most famous war photographs ever taken. It was by Nick Oot of the little girl who is running from an attack of napalm. Her name was Kim Phuc, and she is now a Canadian citizen.
She's now alive and living in Toronto, Canada. So now it's important because we decided it's very small because American soldiers we have very big chest and shoulder.
We've shown how the Viet Cong moved around in underground tunnels.
Straight up and we bend down.
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
It's about 1.3 to 1.5
So
meters.
you like that?
You remember it was about this height.
Right. Don't put the lid on. Just
let me I'm gonna stand on that.
Okay. Sorry. I'm just.
We all thought this lady was very brave to volunteer to go down beneath the jungle in one of the tunnel holes.
And then like this.
Yes.
I think your boobs are too big.
That's not her fault.
It's not her fault now. Oh wow. Yeah, it's okay. You can put the lid on even. Put the lid on. Put the lid on? Yeah. Oh God. Veronica. Yeah. You alright? Yeah. I don't think I can get the lid up.
Every American soldier, they knew that there are many traps set up around, so they will ask one person to look for a trap on the ground and one person to look for traps above the tree.
Some of these traps were devilishly ingenious. This looks like a termite's nest, but it's a watching post, as he explains.
Get out from there, put one leg here and one leg here, and become the watcher.
Wow.
All this weaponry was captured by the Viet Cong, and it's on display at their military workshop and the very noisy shooting range.
And the next one is a clipping armpit trap. When someone falls into the middle of the trap, 2 rows of spikes gonna stand up and stab through the ribs or the body of that person. And the next one is the folding chair trap. The heavier you are, the more damage you get. For this one, we put our feet from here. And for this one, we put it from here. We are walking that way, but the footprint will say that this one moving backward.
The gunshots in the background are from the shooting range nearby.
America knew this, so if everyone wear this one, they all go backward, right? So some of them will wear this one.
A lot to take in, but it was soon time for some jasmine tea and Vietnamese snacks. So difficult to believe so much horror took place here. And of course, Ho Chi Minh is still revered in Vietnam. The capital city is named after him, and that's where we're off to now. The marketplaces in Saigon are frenetically busy and very colourful. They're also pretty noisy. There are dozens of traders selling both street food and local produce brought in from the countryside farms. There is a large rural economy in Vietnam, but wages are very low, which is why so many people migrate to Europe, both legally and illegally. What strikes all visitors to Asia is the number of motorcycles. There are millions of them, and everyone seems to be on them at once. They are the chief source of transport in cities and outlying areas because you can get anywhere on them very cheaply. We are visiting the War Remnants Museum in Saigon, and the Vietnamese government wants to ensure that every visitor to Vietnam, and especially Americans, is made aware of the enormous suffering endured by the people of that country, mainly civilians of course. It is drummed into Vietnamese school children that their grandparents made enormous sacrifices, and for those now in their 70s, it is something of a recent memory. The artifacts in the museum demonstrate the brutality and horror of war, and particularly the very many photographs that have been taken by war photographers, some of whom lost their lives during the conflict, and there were a great many of them working for international press agencies. We have to remember that although we were on holiday, this was more of a cultural trip, and that there was much to learn. The photographs show the terrible effect that Agent Orange and napalm had on children, even yet unborn. The faces of those whose features were terribly disfigured and deformed will stay with me for a long time. Most of the people in the photos were, of course, agricultural workers who were not involved in any fighting. Women and children took the brunt of the war throughout the years it took place and later endured in the aftermath. Civilians always suffer the most. They are not easily pictures to look at, and everywhere in the museum we are confronted with the weapons that were used on both sides, all designed to inflict terrible injuries. The futility of war is a major theme in the War Remnants Museum. Here we are at the Presidential Palace in Saigon, in which President Ho Chi Minh lived and worked. Inside is very plush and palatial, with beautifully furnished rooms, and we were shown the presidential chambers, the meeting rooms in which ambassadors from overseas met the president and occasionally dined with him and other officials. The whole place was sumptuous, even if the homes of the general population were not. There was, of course, a library and a cinema. I did wonder what films were shown in there and how many people watched them. On the walls of the dining room were murals depicting ancient Vietnamese characters. But the serious business took place in the National Security Council chamber. Strategy for war and peace was decided in this very room, with President Ho Chi Minh firmly in control and with access to the outside world via one of these telephones. In the presidential reception rooms, accommodation was available and reserved for visitors. Every guest room had a very nice, comfortable bed and a table to do official paperwork on. In corridors with planters were these delightful glazed figures, all made in the country. This is a painting of Ngong Han Kong Chua, born in 1770 and died in 1799, a royal princess much admired by a communist president. But although some awful things happened in the countries we visited, our trip was far from being all doom and gloom, although we were constantly reminded of the trauma all three countries had suffered. We saw some excellent cultural events too, such as the concert of Thai music at the Amazon Concert Hall in Siem Reap. Our hotels were wonderful, as they always are with Newmarket holidays, and with every facilities and good restaurants. And we had some quite smashing food too, quite exotic in the restaurants we visited. The fellow tourists we were with were all great fun and everyone got on well. If possible, I always try to get a couple of cats in, but when it comes to animals, they are just about everywhere. Today we have a free day in Saigon, so it's off to the zoo. It was one of the pet projects of President Ho Chi Minh.
Today, a very hot day, we're in the Saigon Botanical Gardens and Zoo. Most of the animals are lying down. I think I'd like to lie down myself, but not in this sun, perhaps in the shade. I could do the drink too. I think the cafe calls me now.
The cafe was just around the corner and we had a cold drink. It's not the best zoo in the world, but we saw some interesting creatures, including the common elands, to name it a few. Quite a number of those were around, and some looking after their young. A few elephants were there, of course, in the hot sun, but I'm never comfortable with animals in cages. These ones reminded me of the old London Zoo in the 1950s, with its huge cages full of chimps, monkeys and even gorillas. They have a few gibbons as well, but their botanical gardens are well worth seeing and are kept beautiful by their staff. I think the botanical gardens were the best part of this zoo, and we enjoyed looking around in the orchid house, which was humid to say the least. There are some beautiful specimens here, but your glasses are steaming up all the time. Nevertheless, it was great to see so many rare plants being cultivated. After a couple of hours at the zoo, it was time to visit the market. This says ATMs available here, and Katie is trying to get her head round using one. We'll need some money to spend for later, but first it's to the crocodile farm at Longjuan. We had our lunch here, but first it was a walk over this little bridge to a lake where they all were. If you don't like crocodiles, look away now. They were all very hungry and they will eat anything, including humans. After lunch, it's back on the coach and a chance to look around some of the shops in Saigon and the book market. Like everywhere, go where the locals go. And I brought some tea and Vietnamese soap in here. They're busy making puffed rice at the back of the store. And Hai is showing us what they do with coconuts.
And that machine will make strings or rope out of coconut fiber. And we can make door mats, and we export a lot of that to Japan.
Before we know it, we've got our life jackets on again and are on another boat trip on which we're all handed some very fresh pineapple brought to the vessel by a pineapple seller on a boat.
This is really delicious. Nothing like the pineapple we get in Britain.
The Mekong River is the third longest in Asia at 4,350 kilometres, the world's 12th longest river, and it's vital to the economy. There are vast floating markets, and the people who trade from them might spend their entire lives afloat on the thousands of barges. The Mekong starts in China and flows through Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia and finally Vietnam. We've arrived at a quiet tributary where there's a handicraft market selling things made out of that otherwise useless hyacinth weed that infests the river. It's a nuisance, but they found a use for it. Somewhere on the Mekong, we stopped for tea and watched a little sketch that shows how a Vietnamese wife deals with a drunken husband. Then it's back to the city's big market. But flipping do with this. Jasmine green tea in the market in Saigon. Our last hotel was the New World in Saigon, and on January the 30th we flew home via Dubai. After this wonderful trip we were back in Ilfracombe.